everybody. Good evening. Nice to see you all. Thank you for coming out on what I'm told is the only rainy day of the year in Tucson. I especially want to thank Ed Wright and the Center for Jewish Studies here at Arizona, and of course the Jewish Community Center for inviting me to speak with you a little bit about Jewish communities in Latin America. My story starts tonight when I was a college student, and I had a conversation that changed my life. I was an undergraduate taking a seminar on Afro-Latin American politics and culture. So we were studying about people of African descent in Latin America. And one day in the middle of the semester, our professor came to us and said, I have a question, and everybody can answer except for Jeff. Okay, what was the question? We looked around, and he said, what is a mikveh? The students in the class, all of whom, with the exception of me, were of African descent, started generating answers. Maybe it was a Yoruba king. Maybe it was a food that came from West Africa to the Americas. They had no idea. And finally, our professor explained that a mikveh, of course, is a Jewish ritual bath. So why did he tell us this? Why did he ask this question in a course about the lives of people of African descent in Latin America? Well, as he explained to us, he wanted us to understand that Latin America is more complex than simply white people and black people, or white people and indigenous people, or European people, or something like that. He wanted us to understand that Latin America, like the United States, was filled with multicultural countries of all sorts of people, including Jews. He wanted us to understand that in Latin America, you could know people who were descendants of Poles, and of Syrians, and of Japanese, and of Koreans. And for me, this was a huge, huge and important moment, because for the first time, I started to realize maybe I could think and study about Jewish Latin Americans as a legitimate part of Latin American society. And it wasn't something that had crossed my mind. Today, Jewish Latin Americans, from a halachic perspective, from a Jewish ritual religious perspective, are mostly Ashkenazic, and their origins are in the 19th and 20th centuries. Right? So if you go to Latin America today and you meet Jews, almost all of them are relatively recent generations. Sephardic Jews, who you meet in Latin America today, are mainly from the Middle East. They're not mainly descendants of Iberian Jews from the colonial period. They're contemporary immigrants, in large part coming after 1954 to Latin America. Jewish Latin Americans are often in the highest echelons of Latin America's national economic, education, and residential spheres. And it's not uncommon to meet professionals and intellectuals and politicians with names like Goldenberg and Barenboim and Safra. In this regard, the presence of Jews in most Latin American countries is actually more public than it is in the United States. Right? If we did an analysis of politicians, leaders of industry, intellectuals, etc., Latin America is a place with a huge, huge impact of Jews. Jewish Latin America is very different than Jewish North America. And let me tell you some of the reasons why. First is the broad historical relationship in Latin America between Catholics and Jews. something that didn't generally exist in the United States, where most of the relationship is between Protestants and Jews, right? So unlike here, where the dominant culture is a Protestant one, in most of Latin America, it's a Catholic culture. Second, for many Jewish immigrants to Latin America, there was more fear than hope in their relocation, since they weren't going to the United States or going to Canada. We often forget how important it was in the United States that Jews who came here, Jews and immigrants from all over the world who come here, choose to come here. It's their first choice, right? If they could fill out a questionnaire, to this day, where do you want to go? The United States is often at the top of the list. So Jews who went to Latin America in the 19th and 20th century often wanted to come to the United States. If they couldn't go there, they wanted to go to Canada. But they found themselves someplace else. And finally, a very important difference between Jewish Latin America and Jewish North America are the connections that Jewish Latin Americans have to other ethnic groups, notably Christians and Muslims of Middle Eastern descent, and Latin Americans of Japanese, Chinese, and Korean descent, right? So in the United States, we tend not to think of Arab Americans and Jewish Americans and Korean Americans as kind of the same thing. We think of those as very separate kinds of groups. But in the Latin American context, Jewish Latin Americans, Arab Latin Americans, Chinese Latin Americans, Japanese Latin Americans, all fit together in a kind of large ethnic, social, economic grouping, if you will. In other words, the Jewish diaspora approach that we often hear about, that you probably hear about in lectures like these, often teaches us about how Jews in one place are just like Jews someplace else, right? That's the kind of diasporic approach to things. But one of the great lessons of Latin America is that Jews are often more like non-Jews than they are like Jews in other countries. The country I study is Brazil. That's my area of focus. And it's remarkable how similar Jewish Brazilians are to Japanese Brazilians. Brazil has the largest population of Japanese descent in the world outside of Japan, right? So like one neighborhood in Sao Paulo has more people of Japanese descent than the whole United States, right? So that's how many people there are there. And so if you were to talk to Jewish Brazilians and Japanese Brazilians, wow, they sound very similar in terms of their education, where they live, who they marry, the kinds of jobs that they're in. In fact, Jewish Brazilians are more similar to Japanese Brazilians than they are, for example, to Jewish Canadians. So one of the lessons I'd like to talk about tonight, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A, is what are the moments when thinking about diaspora as the primary way of organizing ethnic communities doesn't always work, right? What happens when ethnicity within the country is sometimes more powerful than ethnicity elsewhere? Just to give you an example, I hope you can see this all. This is a cartoon from the 1930s in Brazil. And what it says is, if you tell me on what street you're walking, I will tell you who you are, right? So the idea is that they're ethnic neighborhoods. But when we look at the groups, we start to see how interesting it is, right? Who's put together? We see here, for example, how only the Jews and the Japanese have children, right? The idea that these are family-oriented groups, right? So you get to see certain kinds of things. I'll just show you who they are. So this is Arab Brazilian, Japanese Brazilian, Afro-Brazilian, Portuguese Brazilian, Italian Brazilian. This is supposed to be fashion, right? And Jewish Brazilian. Okay, so there's an example of how the linkage works in a way that's different than we would expect. In Latin America, it doesn't seem surprising to Latin Americans to find out that the oldest synagogue in the Americas, which is the Calzer de Israel, which is in Recife, Brazil, up there, if you will, is, believe it or not, right across the street from the Japanese Cultural Association. In fact, if you were to go there today, in the middle of that street is a kind of a stands, and one part of the stand you can buy falafel, and the other part yakisoba, right? So again, this gives us a different idea about how ethnicity works than we would expect. I want to sketch for you a little bit the history of Jewish immigration to Latin America and the ethnicities that were created as a result. As you can see, Latin America is a huge region. It has over 20 countries. There are lots of different languages, not just Spanish and Portuguese. There are parts of Latin America where people speak English. There are many, many different indigenous languages. There are all sorts of things. And each of the countries have very different forms of cultural and economic and social development. So rather than telling you a little bit about every single place, which would take us 5 or 6 hours, I'm going to concentrate on Argentina and Brazil, because those are the two countries that have the largest Jewish populations. But we can talk about things later. The first Jewish immigrants to the Americas came from Spain and Portugal in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. A few of those people came as Jews, and others were defined as new Christians, those who had been forced by the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions to convert to Catholicism. This conversionary process, which publicly demanded a rejection of Judaism, didn't always improve the status of those who accepted Catholicism as their own. Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition were in the throes of religious fervor, having recently expelled the Moors, the Muslims, from Iberia. And a concept of blood purity was very strong. It's not unlike the concept used by the Nazis, right? This idea that somebody is not what they believe and what they practice, but they're somehow innately something. And so in Latin America, like in Iberia, many new Christians, even if they were in fact practicing, believing Christians, were often targeted as Jews. Again, this is a story we know from the 20th century as well. It's really hard for us to know precisely how many Jews lived in Latin America in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century. Jewish religious practice, when it occurred, was secret. And most of the time, people who were called Jews, we don't know very much about whether they were or weren't Jews. It's very hard for us to know. One of the great ironies of this period is that the place where historians go to look for information about Jews is in the records of the Inquisition. And it's very strange, because if you think about it, what do we know about the Inquisition? We know they lied. We know they tortured people. They got confessions. So why would we assume that that's the place where, if they say that's a Jew, or that's a Muslim, or that's a pagan, why would we believe them, right? It's a real problem with this data. And that's why I say it's very hard for us to pinpoint precisely who is who in this period, because from a scholarly perspective, our data sources are really, really terrible. One of the interesting results of this lack of clarity is that the idea that Jews formed colonizers of Latin America became wrong. I'm sure you've heard this, right? Columbus was a Jew, Cortez was a Jew, things like that. It's really hard for us to say that with any precision, because we just simply don't know that. Some colonizers even believed we're the lost tribe of Israel, right? So this was a very strong Catholic belief in that period. One French crackpot theorist from the late 19th century even claimed that King Solomon had sailed the Amazon River, and that all of the languages spoken in the Amazon region of Latin America were offshoots of some kind of ancient Hebrew. Now, I'm calling him a crackpot theorist, but this was an important French scholar of the period. He was being read in places, in top universities at the time. Now, I told you at the beginning that one of the things that's interesting about studying Jews in Latin America is you can't study Jews in Latin America without studying other ethnic groups. So when I first heard this story about King Solomon and this idea that I don't know, that the Amazonian indigenous people were really secret Jews, I started looking around, and what I discovered was that other ethnic groups have exactly the same idea. So for example, if you speak to Mexicans of Chinese descent, they'll tell you a story about a great war between Japan and China, in which Japan was powerful and China was weak and about to be defeated. Fine wind came and saved the Chinese by pushing them across the oceans, where they became the Aztecs. Okay, it makes as much sense as King Solomon driving up the Amazon River, right? Even better was I was in Peru and I was talking to some Peruvians of Japanese descent. Here's the story they told me. There was a great war between China and Japan. China was very, very strong. Japan was weak. A divine wind came and pushed the Japanese to safety, where they became the Incas. So you see here, right, how hard it is to understand in the deeper past who's who, what's what. It's okay, the stories are great. They're wonderful, aren't they? They're worth talking about. From a scholarly perspective, I don't spend a lot of time thinking about whether secret identities are real or not real. It's just not my thing. What we can say with some precision is that in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, for much of those periods, there were very few Jews in Latin America who were doing Jewish things that we would recognize today as Jewish. Cemeteries, synagogues, Hebra Kadisha, I don't know, you can think of those kinds of things. We know some Jews did go to Latin America for business reasons, and they sometimes would set up small communal institutions that would come and that they would go. But we also, in the middle of the 1800s, things started to change. One important example of this change began in Morocco. Moroccan Jews in the 19th century were a very interesting group. They spoke lots of languages. They spoke Arabic and Spanish. Morocco was a Spanish protectorate, so they spoke Arabic and Spanish for business. They often spoke French to deal with different kinds of government things. And they spoke another language called Hakitiya, which was a special Jewish Moroccan language that kind of combines aspects of Hebrew, Moroccan, Arabic, and things like that. In 1859, the Spanish-Moroccan War broke out. And of course, the Jews in Morocco started to wonder where their futures would lie. During the war, a few hundred Moroccan Jewish families migrated to Latin America. And by the late 19th century, Jews were leaving Morocco for Latin America in growing numbers. In the 1880s, 95% of the boys completing their education at one of Morocco's Jewish schools migrated to South America. And many of them migrated, let's see if I can, well, do you see up there B-E-L-E-M, Belém, right? Bethlehem, right? This part of Brazil, at the mouth of the Amazon River, was one of the target areas for Moroccan Jews. About 2,000 Jewish men went there at the end of the 19th century because there was a rubber boom going on, right? Today we don't think of rubber as something natural. We think of it as something synthetic. But in those days, it was a thing that came from trees. And so that part of South America was booming. It was so rich in this city that the rubber barons in the city used to send their clothes to France to get washed, right? So that's how fancy things were. So imagine this, 2,000 Jewish boys and men migrate to this area to participate in the trade, in the rubber trade. They did fantastically well. They set up all sorts of communal institutions, but they had a problem. There were no women, right? You know where this story is going. So I was up there, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago in that part of Brazil, and I met an old guy. And I said, so tell me a story about this. Tell me what happened. So I'm just going to read you the story he told me. These are his words translated into English. The Jews arrived without women and without rabbis. Many began a relationship with indigenous women and wanted to marry. Yet there was no rabbi among the immigrants to conduct conversion ceremonies. The leader of the immigrants appointed the most learned member of the group, of the Moroccan Jews, to teach all of the fiancés about Judaism, and emphasized one principle, that there was only one God. On the day of the marriage, the bride-to-be was brought into a room, and she was blindfolded, and she was told that a spoonful of molten gold, burning molten gold, would be put into her mouth, and that if she believed that there was only one God, the gold would taste as sweet as honey. And every woman believed, and the gold always tasted like honey. So it's a very beautiful story about how a Jewish community gets created. And in a sense, this is one of the earliest organized, settled Jewish communities in Latin America. The first Jewish newspaper in Latin America emerges out of these Moroccan Jews. And it's still a community that's very, very important and strong. In fact, if you go to this part of the Amazon today, right, and you can see it's the mouth of the river there, right? There are Jewish tombs and cemeteries all along the river. Like if you get in a little boat and you go down the river, you'll just be someplace and like, oh, what's going on there? And this is from the days of the Moroccan Jews. Local non-Jews today often attribute special powers to the Moroccan Jews who were buried in these little cemeteries, and often turn them into contemporary non-Jewish worship sites, right? So think about this. Non-Jews go to Jewish places to get power, right? It's not what we'd expect. The most famous of these sites is this one, is the tomb of Rabbi Shalom Muyal, who was sent from Morocco to the Amazon in 1908. 2 years after he arrived, he died, and he was buried in a Catholic cemetery. There was no Jewish cemetery around where he died. Within 15 years, reports of miracles taking place at his tomb started to circulate around the Amazon. And soon people started going there. So as you see all these rocks, these aren't from Jewish people. These are from non-Jewish people who go there hoping to get a miracle from the power of the rabbi. Today, the Saint Jewish Miracle Worker, that's his official title, Santo Judeu Milagreiro in Portuguese. And this tomb is such an important part of local culture that Jewish community leaders in Brazil refused a request from the rabbi's family in Israel to move the body there for reburial, right? So again, a really good story for us to think about a different idea of Jewish life. Following this Moroccan Jewish immigration, larger waves of Jewish immigrants started going to Latin America. One of the largest began with a rumor that found its way into the cocktail talk that was circulating among the European Jewish elite at the end of the 19th century. As the story was told, a group of Russian Jews, attracted by notices of cheap land for agricultural colonization in Argentina, had migrated to Argentina to buy land, to set things up. According to the rumor, they had arrived in Buenos Aires and had found that the land wasn't really available. They'd been tricked. And that as a result, there were many Jewish poor, that many of the Jewish women were engaging in prostitution. So this is the rumor that's circulating among the Jewish elite in Europe. The group of Jewish elites, right, so these are people like the Rothschilds, right, these kinds of families, right, decided that they were going to do something about this, that they were going to help solve this problem. And they set up an organization called the Jewish Colonization Association. If any of you have ever gone to the state of Connecticut, that was another place where the Jewish Colonization Association set up colonies, right? So these happened in many, many places. The main inspiration behind the Jewish Colonization Association was Baron Maurice de Hirsch, who was a Bavarian-born Jew, but who lived in Belgium. He decided to, quote, stake my wealth and intellectual powers to give a portion of my companions in faith the possibility of finding a new existence, primarily as farmers, in lands where laws and religious tolerance permit them to carry on. So in other words, he looked at Europe, didn't think it was going all that well there, and thought Latin America might be a good place to set up Jewish communities. In 1891, he set up the Jewish Colonization Association with lots and lots of capital from lots and lots of other wealthy Jewish business people. And 2 years later, they set up their first colony in Latin America, in Argentina, at a place called Moisesville, right? Mosheville. It's a town that still exists today. You can go there to this day. They hoped that Moisesville would not only save all of the Jews who had been in trouble already in Argentina, but would also create new opportunities for Jews to leave Europe and find a new kind of existence. Now, I'm a scholar, so I have to more or less tell you the truth. And I don't want to make it sound like Baron de Hirsch was only interested in philanthropy. He set up Moisesville and the other colonies right along railroad lines where he owned land where he was growing crops, and it turned out to be a pretty good deal for him as well to have these Jewish colonies in these particular places. That said, many, many Jews migrated to Argentina and found lives that certainly they wouldn't have been able to have in Europe. This is a family on one of the Argentine Jewish colonies. Over the years, more and more Jews started migrating to Argentina. I don't see Professor Guy here. We have one of the great specialists on Argentina here in the audience with us. So if you have questions about that, I'm going to direct it to her. More and more Jews started migrating to Argentina, and as often happens, you have a land rush, you have price rises, right? This is exactly what we would expect. And so soon the cost to the Jewish Colonization Association of buying land in Argentina became exorbitant. And they started to think about, where else could we buy? Could we set up new Jewish colonies? Fortunately, right next to Argentina is Brazil. And in the early 20th century, land in Brazil was much, much, much less than it was in Argentina. And so soon the Jewish Colonization Association started creating colonies in the south of Brazil, right? So if you think of that big country of Brazil, all the way in the bottom there. By 1904, the JCA, the Jewish Colonization Association, had established a colony called Philipsen. Philipsen was another railroad owner from Belgium who was also making money there, and still others after that. One of the people who colonies was Schweitzer, remembered how scary it was. He remembered the rumors of diseases, yellow fever, typhoid, cholera, and attacks. It was hard for Jews. They weren't actually farmers in Europe. They were tradespeople. They did other things. And all of a sudden, they became farmers, right? They didn't know what was going on. Even so, the Jewish farming colonies in Argentina and Brazil were very similar to each other. They all were set up as a kind of a recreation of an Eastern European Jewish settlement. Right, these are two of them. But here's an example. This is a typical family, very poor farming family on one of these settlements. I love this photograph. I show it to my students in the modern Latin American history class, and I kind of say, you know, write something about it. And everybody says, oh, they say this is Europe, you know, maybe this is the ghetto in Warsaw. I don't know. They think it's all sorts of things. And when I tell them it's Brazil, they can't believe it. I'll tell you another funny story. I showed this photograph to a very dear friend of mine in Brazil because I was so beautiful. It's such a beautiful photo. He looked, he said, oh, I know that photograph. That's my mom. Right? So, you know, again, a small world. These Jewish colonies, the life was characterized by Yiddish, by the study of Hebrew as a religious language, right? Not a language of regular conversation. And the attempt to recreate Europe in Latin America didn't work very well, to be perfectly honest. It didn't work well because it wasn't Europe. It didn't work well because these weren't farmers. It didn't work well because they were very isolated. And so over the course of the early 20th century, the colonies in Latin America gave way to movement to urban centers to create the Jewish world of Latin America that we know today. Which, if you go to these colonies, for example, this colony, Philipsen, Erechim, if you go there today, there's a few Jews who own all the land, but there's no community, so to speak. Everybody has moved into one of the local cities. So by the time World War I comes around, Jewish life in Latin America wasn't Moroccan, it wasn't farming, but it had become something like the Jewish lives we think of as typical today. Based in large cities, Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Rio, Buenos Aires, Santiago, you name it, Montevideo, everything that you would think. And in the cities, Jews moved into new kinds of economic areas. Many, many Jews started out as peddlers. This was one of the most common forms of economic ascension among Jews. In many places in Latin America, Jews bought their goods from Arabs who had migrated the generation before. So the Arabs had migrated, had become peddlers, were successful, bought factories, then sold their goods to Jews who became peddlers, who bought the factories of the Arabs as the people of Arab descent sent their kids to become doctors and lawyers and engineers and everything else. By entering Latin America in mass in a period when the economy was growing, many Jews, as I said in the introduction, rose into the working classes, the middle classes, the upper middle classes, and the upper classes. When we trace Jewish ascension overall in Latin America, it's faster than it was in the United States, right? So in this regard, Latin America was a really, really good place for Jews. Of course, I don't want to make it sound like it was all rosy. There was nativism, there was racism. In Mexico, a group called the Golden Shirts had an anti-Semitic movement similar to the Brown Shirts. In Brazil, there was a group called the Green Shirts that did the same thing. There was a particularly terrible moment in 1919 in Argentina, what was called the Tragic Week, when there was a massacre of Jews by the state and by anti-Semites. But all of that said, I don't want you to leave tonight thinking that the history or the story of Latin American Jewish life is a story of suffering and anti-Semitism. That isn't true. That wouldn't be accurate. I want to spend a few minutes talking specifically about the country I study, Brazil, because it's a particularly interesting example of Jewish life in Latin America. As I'm sure you know, Brazil is a huge country. Brazil is larger than the continental United States in terms of territory, right? So don't believe the maps that make the United States look bigger. Actually, Brazil is in terms of territory. It's a country of immigrants like the United States. As I said, it has the largest population of Japanese descent in the world outside of Japan, the largest population of Lebanese descent outside of Lebanon. It's a very, very, very multicultural country. It's also interesting from a Jewish perspective because it's one of the very few countries in the Americas where the Jewish population expanded after the Russian Revolution and after World War I. So in general, when we think about the history of Jews in the Americas, we have kind of a pattern, right? In the mid-19th century, Jews from Central Europe come, German-speaking Jews. They're relatively integrated. They're relatively middle class. They set up community institutions. Then at the end of the 19th century, Jews from Eastern Europe come. The German Jews are kind of embarrassed, right? They're trying to get the Eastern European Jews to stop speaking Yiddish, right? To shave their beards, to fit in, right? And then comes during World War II, right? So that's the normal way we think of Jewish history in the Americas. In Brazil, it's not like that. In the 19th century, there are no German Jews, right? All there are those Moroccan Jews who I was telling you about. So that means when Jews come after the Russian Revolution and after World War I, A, they primarily come from Poland, not Russia, and B, they become the community bosses. So in other words, instead of German Jews being embarrassed by Polish Jews, it's the opposite, right? The Polish Jews run everything. In fact, there's an incredible story. There was an Italian Jewish Zionist in Brazil named Camarini. And he was called by everybody Kamarinsky, right? Because the Polish Jews didn't really accept him as an Italian, but by changing his name. If I told you this story in the United States, right, there'd be, you know, the German Jews would make Camarini be called Kamer or something like that, right? You'd switch it around. So in this regard, Brazil is a really interesting story for us in thinking about Jewish life in a different way. This is also an interesting period because in Brazil, like in Argentina, there are moments of very right-wing governments where, ironically, Jewish community organizations often thrive. It's one of the things that we don't expect, right? We often think of the right wing as being anti-Semitic, but in this case, even if they had anti-Semitic discourses, they often allowed Jewish communities to expand. By the end of World War II, Argentina had a Jewish population of about 350,000 people. Brazil had about 120,000, Uruguay 50,000, Mexico 35,000. Following World War II, however, things started to change. Obviously, 1948 is a huge moment in this, and so Jews in Latin America, like in the rest of the world, start thinking about the future in a new way when Israel is created. The anti-Zionist movement, often associated with the Third World, also is important in this story. And so in Latin America, in Brazil and Argentina, you get a growing movement that sometimes conflates anti-Judaism and anti-Zionism, right? Not always. Although, again, to be fair, in all of the countries in Latin America, you have young Jews who become politically active, who are sometimes anti-Zionists, part of their own political activity, right? I don't want you to think that anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism. With the creation of the State of Israel, you also have real differences between what happens in the different countries. For example, in Argentina and in Uruguay, during periods of dictatorship, large numbers of Jews moved to Israel. Very, very large numbers of Jews moved to Israel. Brazil has a very low aliyah rate. It looks like the United States. Most Brazilian Jews stay in Brazil, and it doesn't matter if they're left-wing governments or right-wing governments, stay in Brazil, that is. It doesn't really matter. And this question of the dictatorships in Latin America, which were very strong in the 1960s and 1970s, and perhaps are returning today, has really created challenges for Jewish communities. On the one hand is the question within the community of what does it mean to live either in or out of a democracy, right? That's a challenge always for Jewish communities. What does it mean to be within a national democracy, and how is the Jewish community itself acting democratically, right, within itself? It's in Brazil, where I spend most of my time, it's very, very hard, because even in the period of democracy, the Jewish community doesn't always act democratically as a formal operation. So that's something that's been very, very hard in the broad sense, right? This is from Argentina. It says, "Today we are all Jewish," and this is a democratic movement, right? And this has to do with what happened, a bombing that took place in Argentina. At the same time, Zionism today has become very, very complicated for many Jews in Latin America, right? Without getting into my or your opinions, we can state in a scholarly sense that it's confounding for many Jews who, on the one hand, are committed to democracy. They sometimes see what's going on in Israel as antithetical to that. For example, in Brazil recently, an extremely right-wing president was elected. He has strong evangelical support, and he has a very pro-Zionist, a pro-Israel message that comes out of evangelical theology. And it's confusing for Jews. What do you do in a case like that? I don't have answers for you. And so that's a part of modern Jewish life that's very, very hard. But even with all that difficulty, I want to go back to my earlier point, and I want to close with that, which is one of the things that's most interesting for us in North America about Jewish life in Latin America is how connected Jews are to other ethnic groups, not separated, but connected. And I want to finish just showing you this photograph. So right now I'm doing a research project in Sao Paulo that has to do with health and migration. And as part of that research project, I've worked, when I'm in Brazil, about 20 hours a week on a medical team as part of the Brazilian National Health Service in a public health clinic in a neighborhood that used to be called the Jewish neighborhood of Sao Paulo. And it's a neighborhood that today is interesting to me. I don't know if you can see the signs, but this is a project my team and I did for vaccination to speak to people in the community. So we did signs in Hebrew, Spanish, Portuguese, Korean, Chinese, and Greek. And if you go to that clinic today, right now, right now, that's closed. But if we went tomorrow morning, you would sit in a clinic and you would meet Orthodox Jews and secular Jews, Koreans who don't speak Portuguese and their children who don't speak Korean. You would meet people from Bolivia and Peru who speak Spanish as their second language, not as their first language. They speak a different language as their first language. Then they speak Spanish, then they speak Portuguese. And this is a reminder for me today that even now, when we think about Jewish life in Latin America, it's important to remember Jewish life not as separatist, but as together. Thank you.